We will spend the next few moments introducing some basic concepts related to population ecology. And just to begin, let's be sure we define a population. Simply, populations refer to a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same area at the same time. There are some important characteristics that population biologists tend to be interested in. So, for example, we can talk first of all about the dispersion of organisms within a given population. So, for example, sometimes we see that organisms are found in a clumped pattern, sometimes in a uniform pattern, like the penguins here, and other times simply at random. So dispersion is one important characteristic of populations. In addition, growth rate of populations, whether populations are growing or shrinking. Ultimately, we can sort of talk about growth rates of populations by really just including four major factors. Namely, the growth rate of a population includes births minus deaths, so B minus D. And of course, you also have to incorporate immigrants minus emigrants, or I minus E. So ultimately, those are the factors that determine growth rates of populations. In addition, we can talk about density of organisms within a population. So here we see a swarm of starlings, these birds that are very common. They can be found in very dense patches, at least at times. And finally, we'll just mention that range, the area across which organisms are found within a population. That too is another important characteristic of populations. Now, if you think about all of the species of animals that are out there in nature, many species have different approaches in terms of their reproductive success. So the basic question we're addressing here is, how likely is it that organisms are to survive over time? Now we can introduce these graphs simply referred to as survivorship curves. So for example, if you take a look at this graph here, this represents survivorship curves for three different species. It summarizes types 1, types 2, and type 3 survivorship curves. So for example, humans, for the most part, this day and age, most babies that are born, they tend to live into adolescent years, teenage years, and it's not until we reach the end of our maximum lifespan that most humans tend to die off. The other extreme, illustrated by clams, mussels, starfish, sea urchins, they have a different approach. They produce many, many, many offspring, most of which, of course, don't survive long at all. Relatively few make it to their maximum lifespan. And then type 2 survivorship curves, illustrated by many small mammals, they are essentially equally likely to die, whether they are at a young or an old age. So again, just summarizing the types 1, 2, and 3 survivorship curves. How is it that we're able to actually measure or estimate population sizes? Well, sometimes it's just as simple as going out and counting directly the number of organisms in a population. If we can get a visual image of a population, we can take digital images and process those with fairly simple computer software to get an estimate of populations that include large numbers of organisms. But what about estimating populations of organisms where it's just hard to see and hard to keep track of them? There is another approach we can take, namely the mark recapture technique. So for example, let's just say you're interested in estimating the number of grasshoppers in a field. Obviously, you can't directly count those. They're difficult to see. They're moving around all the time. So we can estimate the number of grasshoppers in a field by using this mark recapture technique. How does it work? Well, in essence, you would do the following. Go out one day for a set amount of time, let's say for half an hour, collect as many grasshoppers as you can, and then you somehow mark those grasshoppers, perhaps with a small dab of paint. You then re-release them back into their environment, and then come back the next day, and again for the same amount of time, 30 minutes let's say, and again collect as many grasshoppers as you can. Hopefully some of those that you recapture the second day in your second sample are ones that you had caught the previous day. And you of course would know that whether or not they had a dab of paint on them, whether or not they were marked. So you do that, you keep track of your numbers, and you get an estimate of your population size with a fairly simple equation. You simply say the number that you marked the first day multiplied by the total that you caught your second day, divided by how many of those that you caught the second day that were actually marked. So again, there are constraints and problems and pitfalls with that technique, but that gives you a way to estimate population sizes. If you think about trying to describe growth of populations, there are various mathematical models that people use to do this. So for example, we can first of all talk about simple exponential growth. So this is a situation which represents kind of a hypothetical ideal situation. So unlimited resources, no predators, no constraints. This essentially represents unlimited, unchecked growth of organisms in a population. Again, it typically doesn't happen in nature, at least not for very long. In contrast, we could talk about the logistic growth model. This essentially incorporates the concept of a carrying capacity. So if we think about these two growth models, so exponential growth illustrated in red, logistic growth illustrated in blue, what we can see is that the logistic growth model incorporates the concept of carrying capacity, illustrated by the letter K in this image. So the idea is that, yes, growth rates start out pretty fast initially, but the closer the population gets to the carrying capacity, the slower that growth rate becomes. So again, just two ways of thinking about and modeling population growth. What are some of the factors that affect population growth? Well, first of all, we can talk about density-independent factors. So these are events that can impact populations that don't rely at all on the density or the size of the population to begin with. So you can imagine if a major storm comes through, that could potentially wipe out an entire population of birds or insects in a given area. Right? The point is, it has this kind of impact regardless of what the initial population size or density is. On the other hand, we can identify various density-dependent factors. So these are things that really matter depending on how dense or how large the population size happens to be. So you can imagine the more individuals there are in a population, of course, the more competition there is for resources, mates, and so forth. Also, the more organisms there are, the more difficult it might be to deal with wastes that it might accumulate in the environment. So again, that can have an impact. Also, many diseases, they actually, the spread of those diseases actually is determined largely by the density or the size of the population in question. Okay, so again, just illustrating various density-dependent and independent factors. Finally, just a few comments on global human population growth. If you take a look at this image here, this represents a schematic of the growth of human population over time. Notice, of course, the human population has been expanding exponentially. And it's grown a tremendous amount in a fairly short period of time. Overall, the human population is still increasing, although the growth rate has decreased a slight amount over the past few decades. So, just a few statistics for you. Right now, we are over 7 billion people. That means roughly each minute there are 150 people added to Earth. That, of course, incorporates all the people that are being born and all of those that are dying, so a net gain of 150 per minute. We might double Earth's population in 50 years. Now think about that. That's pretty profound. Think about how long it has taken to reach 7 billion people. And now we're saying in the next 50 years, we can add another 7 billion people. So that's obviously going to have lots of implications in terms of lifestyle, quality of life, and resource needs in the future. And then finally, carrying capacity. What is Earth's carrying capacity for humans? Well, we don't know, right? It just depends on a lot of factors. It depends on how many resources people are willing to use and rely upon for their daily lifestyle. Again, it just is simply unknown at this point. You might come across estimates anywhere between 12 and 30 billion people. Again, obviously, that number will depend largely on the amount of resources that individuals use as part of their daily lifestyle. So that concludes our brief introduction to population ecology.